You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Hope everybody is enjoying their summer. Hope everybody is staying healthy and safe at the same time. Just a couple of reminders. Make sure you follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, as well as our YouTube channel. We really want to grow the social media following because it's super important to us to be able to connect with you guys. So again, Hazard Ground Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're almost at 1,000 followers on Instagram, so we want to get there very quickly, as well as the YouTube channel. Tons of subscribers. We're getting a lot of hits and a lot of love on YouTube. So just go to youtube.com, in that search bar, type in Hazard Ground Podcast. You'll find us, hit that subscribe button, and we are nearly at 2,000 subscribers there as well. So let's keep the push going forward. Don't forget about our promotion with Amazon on our website, hazardground.com. Click on that Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab. Goes right to amazon.com. Do all your normal Amazon shopping. We get a percentage of what you spend, and we donate that percentage back to some of the great charities that you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. Finally, I've been getting a lot of questions from people about which charities to donate to, which charities and veterans organizations should people help out with. And, you know, it's a very interesting conversation to have because the first thing I tell people is that I can't make that decision for you. You shouldn't base your donation, your time, your efforts off of what I think and what I feel is a good organization. You have to do your research on your own. You have to figure out which one of these organizations and their values and their mission statement lines up with what you believe is the best way for your money, your time, your efforts to go towards helping veterans. There are a lot of veterans charities out there that do different things. And there are a lot of veterans charities out there that are tied into political groups. And that is something you need to be very, very cautious of. And so do your research, figure out what you want to do and how you want to help veterans and how you want to make their lives better. And then do the research on every charity that you come across, every organization that you come across, and figure out which values line up with yours. That is crucially important to making sure that you're comfortable and confident with where the money that you're giving, where the time that you're giving is going. So again, if you want to help out veterans and help out veterans' lives, absolutely go to Amazon and do our promotion because we do a good job at vetting veterans companies. Now, we don't prevent a guest from coming on to talk about any charity that they support. That is fine. But as far as the money that we donate, that we get from you guys back to veterans charities, we do a very good job at vetting those companies and looking very hard at which companies align with the values of the Hazard Ground Podcast. And those are the ones that we choose to give our money back to. And I suggest that you do the same. So just a little bit of a sort of, kind of guidelines for what to do with veterans charities and what to do with veterans organizations and how they want to help. It's different for every person. So again, do your research, do your homework, figure out what you want to do with your time, your money, and how you want to help out, and do it that way. And of course, we are so appreciative of everybody who donates to us because we want to help out veterans and enrich their lives as well. So now that all that is out of the way, let's get on to this week's episode. And joining us this week on the podcast is a return of a guest from episode 133. He is the author of the book We Were Soldiers, which was turned into a movie. He is also one of America's premier war and foreign correspondents for over half a century, where he spent 20 years of his career as a senior editor and senior writer for U.S. News and World Report magazine. He has a new book out called They Were Soldiers. He is Joe Galloway joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Joe, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
Welcome back. Last time we chronicled your time in Vietnam. Again, it was made into the movie We Were Soldiers. You were the reporter played by Barry Pepper, who, chose journalism over the uniform and ended up becoming the first American civilian to be awarded the Bronze Star with Valor, as you were in Vietnam. After Vietnam, your work continued through many countries throughout the world, covering the military and different events. And eventually this brings you to Desert Storm in 1991, and we wanted to focus on that because, we don't really, of all the guests we have, Joe, we don't have many people who have told the story of Desert Storm because it was so quick, it was so, sort of easy in the grand scheme of things. We just kind of wanted to get some more background from you as somebody who was there, and obviously there were a lot of connections between your time in Vietnam and your time in Desert Storm, as there was a major who you met in Vietnam named Norman Schwarzkopf, who ended up being a very pivotal part of the Desert Storm invasion.
Indeed, he was.
Okay, so tell me at first, after everything that you had gone through in Vietnam, just did you ever think about doing a different career? Did you ever think about everything that you went through and said, you know what, maybe it's time for me to choose a different profession because this one obviously is more than I bargained for?
Never thought that one time. I loved what I was doing. I loved it from the very beginning until the very end, 55 years later, and half a dozen wars and revolutions. It was what made me who I am. It gave me a unique view of soldiers and Marines in combat. It gave me a love of those troops and an understanding that I owed them an obligation to tell the truth about what they were doing and to tell their stories to the world.
To that end, Joe, some of the other sort of engagements that you covered prior to Desert Storm, because for the rest of America, right, Vietnam ended. We didn't really get into another major conflict again until Desert Storm. I mean, I know it's hard to sort of just gloss over them, but tell people what some of the things that you covered in between Desert Storm and Vietnam.
Oh, I covered the 1971 India-Pakistan War from Dhaka, which started off in East Pakistan, and a week after that was suddenly the independent nation of Bangladesh, having been liberated by the Indian Army. And I was right in the middle of that. And there was a Marxist student rebellion in Sri Lanka that same year that I covered. There was the Indonesian invasion of Portuguese Timor Island, covered that. If there was trouble anywhere around, United Press International said, get on a plane and get over there and cover it.
Did you, just out of curiosity, did you cover any of the Iran hostage crisis and things of that nature?
The Iran hostage crisis, I did not cover, although I knew some of the key participants. Colonel Charlie Beckwith was an old friend from Vietnam as a major, and some of his Delta Force people have been friends through the years, so I know a fair bit about it, but I was not covering it at the time.
Okay, just curious. All right, so as the build-up for Desert Storm starts to happen, where are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C., and I am working for U.S. News and World Report magazine. And my boss, I had just written a 25th anniversary of the Ia Drang battle cover article for U.S. News. And my boss said, okay, where's your old battalion? I said, well, they're in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert getting ready to go to war with Iraq. And he said, well, get over there and cover them. And when you finish covering them, come back to Fort Hood, Texas, and cover the wives and kids and community where they came out of. So I haul ass to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, and send word out to the 1st Cavalry Division that I would like to come spend some time with them. And they had a commanding general at the time, John Tillelly, whose idea was that he didn't have to host any media people, that the story of the first cab in Desert Storm would be chronicled by the U.S. Army historians, not understanding that they work about 10 years out. And journalists work the next day.
Right.
So, I sat there for a few days and nothing happened. And then I had an idea, and I sent word to the division command sergeant major, a fellow named Bob Wilson. And he had been a 8th Cav trooper in the Ia Drang Valley and had been wounded. And after a time in an Army hospital, he came out. He went to OCS. He went back to Vietnam as a captain commanding an infantry company. And then after the war ended, the Army said, "You don't have a degree, so you have a choice here. Either we throw you out of the Army or you take a bus back to Master Sergeant." And he chose that, and then rose back through the ranks to command sergeant major of a division. And then later in the Gulf War, he was the 7th Corps command sergeant major. Be that as it may, as soon as he got word that I was sitting in the hotel and nothing was happening, he came and picked me up, took me straight to the 1st Squadron 7th Cavalry, which was getting ready to go out for a week of exercises in the desert. And I went with them. And interestingly, I would do a Christmas Eve cover of the magazine and put the commanding officer, the 1st of the 7th Cav, Skip Sharp, Lieutenant Colonel, on the cover of the magazine. He later would rise to 4 stars before he retired from the Army. And when I came back from that week in the desert with the 7th Cav, Sergeant Major Wilson picked me up and said, "I'm taking you to breakfast at the General's Mess." And we go over there, and there's the General and his Chief of Staff sitting across from us, and the two of us sitting there, and that's all that's in this big room. And General Tillelly is sitting there glowering at me and glowering at his command sergeant major, and we're having a ball. We're having a great breakfast and talking old times, and it was you had to be there. And I took off from there, went as directly as possible from Saudi Arabia to Killeen, Texas, and Fort Hood, and spent time with the wives, went to the schools, talked to the teachers, the counselors. There were a lot of frightened children. Some of them, both their mother and their father had deployed to future combat in the Middle East, and there were a lot of scared kids. And I wrote this Christmas Eve cover on the battalion, the division, the families, and I was back home. And the boss said, "Well, get ready to go back over for when it really kicks off." And sure enough, come January, I was out to Andrews Air Base and got on a a C-141 or some big damn aircraft. And we flew first to Germany and then from Germany to Dhahran. And my assignment was to Schwarzkopf's headquarters and in Riyadh. And I got in a hired car and drove straight to Riyadh and checked in the Marriott Hotel across the street from Schwarzkopf's headquarters, and checked around and found that the only thing you could cover was a 1-hour daily briefing, and they weren't approving anything for you to cover. You couldn't go out to the troops. You couldn't do diddly squat. And I put in probably 10 or 12 requests to fly a bombing mission with the B-52s out of Diego Garcia, to go out to the Scud killer missile units, to go here, to go there, to do this, to do that, and nothing came back. It was just silence. They would throw them into a desk drawer. And then one night we were up all night with Scud attacks. And finally I laid down about 8 o'clock in the morning to get a little sleep, and the phone started ringing. And each time there was a call, it was a different public affairs officer saying, well, about your request to go out and cover a B-52 raid, we're working that. They'd hang up, and the next minute I'd get another call from a different public affairs guy with my next request. And I thought, this is curious as hell. And then the last call was from the Navy captain, who was Schwarzkopf's PAO. And he said, why didn't you tell me you knew the general? And I said, well, I know a lot of generals. I don't usually talk about them. He said, well, he wants to see you at 1100 hours. I'll escort you across the street. And he did. And as soon as we walked into Schwarzkopf's office, he threw the Navy captain and everybody else out of his office, slammed the door, went over and took the cover off his battle map. Now, this is 2 weeks before G-Day. And there it all is, exactly what he's planning to do. And we sit there and talk about that for a while and talk about Vietnam for a while. And he says, I know you want to go with the 1st Cav, but they're going to be in my Central Reserve Force. And this is going to go so quick, they may not get even a sniff of this war. So I've got a better idea for you. I'm going to send you to the commander I have over here, who is most like General Hal Moore. Moore, by the way, was Schwarzkopf's TAC officer at West Point when he was a cadet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Talk about connectivity.
It's a very small world in the professional military, let me assure you.
Yeah, it is.
And he says, I'm going to send you to the division that has the most challenging and dangerous mission in my battle plan. And I said, Jesus, Norm, I thought we were friends. And laughed. And he laughed, and he said, I'm sending you to Major General Barry McCaffrey and the 24th Infantry Division Mech. And he said, now, what am I doing wrong here? And I said, Norm, you're in far greater danger from the 350 reporters across the street than from the Iraqi army across the berm. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "They are the most militarily illiterate bunch I have ever seen. There are food editors, there are travel editors, there are people who wouldn't know one end of an M16 from the other."
Right.
And he said, "Well, what do I have to do with that?" And I said, "Well, first of all, they're a danger to you and your command through their ignorance. And second of all, you could fix this by starting War 101. He said, "What's that?" I said, "That's about a 2-hour daily briefing. First day, you bring in the world's leading expert on the M1A1 Abrams tank. The next day, you bring in the world's leading expert on the Firefinder anti-artillery radar, and so forth." And he said, "I could do that." He told me during the map briefing that the Marines were beating him up, wanting to do an amphibious assault landing on the Kuwaiti beaches. He said it would be a bloodbath, and I ain't going to let them do it. So I tucked that away in the back of my head, and sure enough, next day he started War 101 for these reporters. And the Abrams tank and the radar. And then on the third day, I'm sitting there, and the world's leading expert on marine combat amphibious assault landings is there to tell you how they would do it. He didn't say they were going to do it, but he said, "This is how you do it." And the next morning, every paper in America, every national TV anchor in the country was on and on about the coming marine amphibious assault landing. And amongst the press in the hotel and the 1,200 who were in the International Hotel in Dhahran, they were stabbing each other in the back and stomping over each other to get on the pool assigned to the Marines floating offshore. And I'm sitting there biting my tongue, biding my time and saying nothing. And the Schwarzkopf pulled off the perfect piece of information warfare with that little gig. Didn't lie to the press, just sort of laid the honey out and the flies came to it. Saddam Hussein moved at least one and maybe two divisions to cover the beaches of Kuwait against the coming marine amphibious assault landing. So very successful information operation. And I sat there for a while listening to the briefings for a few more days. And then about 10 days before G-Day, before the invasion, I just disappeared and went to the 24th Division. Went to headquarters. Barry McCaffrey, who I had not met before, although he had been a captain in the Cav in Vietnam, welcomed me. He said, "I'm going to clear the way for you to sit in on the commander's evening briefing, even though it's highly classified. And I'm going to tell them that they can trust you because I trust you, and I trust you because Schwarzkopf trusts you, but most of all, I trust you because you're coming with me." Very cogent argument.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And that's how it went. I had 10 days. I traveled around that division. I interviewed brigade commanders, artillery commanders, the LRP team commanders, And I would come home to my tent at night and sit down and write it all up and stack it up. My agreement was that I would not write anything until we crossed the berm in the invasion. And at that point, the public affairs major who worked for McCaffrey would take all of my copy to the casualty fax and fax it directly to my boss in Washington, D.C. at U.S. News, completely bypassing all of this bullshit about pools, which they put together, I think, 10 pools of 10 journalists each pool under a colonel who had full authority to censor what they were writing, to throw it in the waste can if he chose. And when you have a war that's only going to last 100 hours, those pool reports moved very slowly to the rear and arrived after the war was over. So I had a free ride outside the pool, and a Washington Post female writer had the same free ride with the commander of the Marines. And we were the two who got the stories. The public affairs major at the 24th Infantry Division would fly out in a Black Hawk before dark each afternoon and pick up any copy I wanted to send, any film I wanted to send back, and take it back to their rear headquarters in Kuwait. And I couldn't have asked for a better ride to a war.
Can I ask one quick question? You mentioned how you said Schwarzkopf didn't lie to the rest of the reporters who all moved towards the beach. What did he not lie about versus, I guess, deliberately misled because he knew that wasn't the point of the invasion?
Well, all he did was send in the world's leading expert on marine amphibious assault landings to tell them how you do that.
Oh, okay. All right. I see.
He never said, we're going to do it.
He just made everybody believe by the class, so to speak,
by the fact the guy briefed, they all immediately assumed that meant there would be a combat landing on the beaches of Kuwait. And they ran with it.
As did Saddam Hussein, obviously.
Yes, indeed. And when it was known what the outcome was, none of those who dipped their wings in the honey had any complaint at all. They understood they had been had, or they had had themselves, but they hadn't been lied to either.
Sure. So when they cross the berm and they head into Iraq, and this, the Gulf War truly kicks off, because it happened so quickly, how do you chronicle that? Like, what was the toughest part of covering the Gulf War for you?
Well, the toughest part was riding in the back seat of a Humvee that had no back wall. And we're between two columns of M1 tanks, 150 meters on the left, 150 meters on the right, and we're eating dirt for 26 straight hours across the western Iraq desert. I thought I would choke to death on that stuff. And we finally came out to a logger point and stopped and just sat there in a stupor. And of course, it then started raining in the middle of the desert. And, we thought, what the hell else could possibly happen? And along come another Humvee, and the driver said, "Is there a Mr. Galloway in that vehicle?" And this admin captain who was driving us across the desert, he said, "Yeah, he's here." Says, "Well, General Scott wants to see him." And the captain looks over his shoulder at me and says, "This is going to be the quickest interview in history. General Terry Scott don't talk to reporters." And I got in the Humvee and we went over to this funny command trailer, which was sitting on the back of an 18-wheeler flatbed. And I went inside, and there's Terry Scott, Brigadier General, Assistant Division Commander. And we talked for about a half hour about this particular fight we're in, and then about 3 hours about Vietnam. And, it was just remarkable. And the next day, I got in Barry McCaffrey's Black Hawk Command helicopter with him. The brigades were sent out, each on a separate mission, and we flew the battlefield, taking a briefing from each of the brigades, issuing new orders. It was all going fast, and it was all right in front of me.
Were you surprised at the speed of it? Even though, despite what you were told ahead of time, the best laid plans never rarely come to fruition in combat. Were you surprised at how quickly things went and how effective they were?
Not only how quickly and how effectively, but how inexpensively in American blood.
Yeah.
Because among the other things I learned back doing all of these interviews is that Barry McCaffrey had 3,000 body bags stockpiled in the rear, just in case. He had over 1,000 reserve troops to fill casualty vacancies. So they were looking ahead and not assuming anything. They were prepared for some disastrous outcomes. Thank God they didn't come to pass.
Are you ever sort of surprised when you think about it? We had about 150 total combat deaths, U.S. combat deaths in Desert Storm. We lost 19 men in Somalia during Black Hawk Down. We lose, unfortunately, large numbers to like school shootings and things of that nature. And yet, is it weird to you how, we don't ever look at Desert Storm in any negative light, but yet Black Hawk Down always has this air of political, and sort of poor strategic decisions and things of that nature versus because Desert Storm was such a success, we don't even measure the amount of casualties that we even lost in it. Does that ever sort of rattle around in your mind?
Well, it does, because a year after the end of Desert Storm, I was asked to MC a ceremony at Arlington Cemetery marking the deaths of, I think it was 200 Americans, a fair number of them friendly fire incidents.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought going out there, this is not many casualties. But when I got there and I stood on the podium and behind that microphone and looked out, I was looking at 200 spouses, several hundred children who had no father left, And I realized you may have just a few dead, but each death casts ripples that are almost unbelievable in how far they reach to spouses, children, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, uncles, cousins, classmates, friends. Each one violently impacts 30, 40, 50 human beings. I had then gained a much better understanding of the difference between an entire war with fewer casualties than we suffered in 4 days in the Ia Drang Valley at Landing Zone X-Ray and Landing Zone Albany. 234 dead in those 4 days. 305 dead in the month of November in that campaign. 500 wounded. And not a single one of us left that place the same man he was when he arrived. We left there with enough disastrous memories of death and dying and bloodshed to people our nightmares for a lifetime.
Wow. Incredibly said. Okay.
It really
I mean, it just puts it in perspective. And I guess that's what I was aiming at with the question. It's just funny how we shape perspective based off of the results. And yet we never put the Gulf War in any sort of perspective of anything when that went wrong, and some of that may be political in nature. Some of that may be.
You mentioned Black Hawk Down.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a perfect picture of a great, almost casualty-free operation that suffered drastically from mission creep. You had a Navy admiral sitting on top of the command chain in Somalia who, I don't think had the least understanding of special operations, special forces, missions and how they are conducted. And, they just kind of were walked into a bad situation. 19 good Americans died and a couple were taken prisoner, and it was, it's what they call in the Army a real snafu.
Yeah, to say the least.
And not the fault of the men who went on the mission they were ordered to go on. But, you just look at it and you shake your head. You look at the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the lack of preparedness. And when it was prepared for, you had that arrogant, ignorant SOB Rumsfeld sitting in the Pentagon with the pip fiddle, the time-phased deployment plans looked like the New York phone book and about the same size print. And Rumsfeld is sitting there going through it with a Sharpie, striking out units that are scheduled to deploy without the least understanding of where they fit into a large puzzle. You strike out Thanksgiving deployment of the port workers who will unload the ships. You reach over here and you strike out a brigade of military police to secure Baghdad when you take it, and to keep people from looting, stealing, cheating, burning down ministry buildings. You take away the people that you're going to need because you're an ignorant son of a bitch. And you see something like that, and it just curdles your blood because it's hidden for a disaster.
You went back to cover the Iraq invasion in 2003. Obviously some time passes between Desert Storm and that, but before I get to that, though, you were part of the Haiti Incursion as well. Significance of Haiti?
Well, I got there and I talked to the people who we sent down there, and they were all in agreement that the only way anyone could fix what was wrong with Haiti was for us to stay there while an entire new generation were born, educated, and came of age to take over the country. And everyone said that's what we need to do, but we're never going to do. We'll be gone from here in 6 months. And we were. And what needed to be done never got done. And so, Miami will receive boatloads of Haitian refugees for decades to come because there's no hope left on that island. I flew it in a Black Hawk down the river that separates Haiti from the Dominican Republic. And on one side, there are the beautiful green jungles and hills. And on the other side, it looks like it's been nuked. The people have cut down every tree on the island for firewood. They cut it down, and that means when it rains, which is often, the hillsides roll down and fill up the riverbeds, and then it floods. And one disaster is piled on another disaster, and the people suffer more. Hunger, disease. And, I went down with Special Forces and went down first with General Scott from the Desert Storm I talked about, Terry Scott, and an Air Force general called Fig Newton, who was the deputy commander of SOCOM. And the three of us got in a Black Hawk, and we flew and visited all 32 A-teams on Haiti. And then I picked out the one I thought would be most interesting and came back and spent a couple of weeks with an Alabama Reserve A-team in a place called Mirabalai in the Voodoo Highlands. And got a, real good look on the ground, spent time with the 25th Division out of Hawaii, which came in. What a dreadful place. And everybody was right. We needed to stay 30 years to make a change for the good. And there's no way we were going to do that.
All right. So after Haiti comes the Iraq War and the invasion in 2003. Now, knowing what you had known about the Iraqi army from Desert Storm and this invasion upcoming, what notes did you compare, and did you think it was going to be as easy?
I didn't think it was going to be that easy because we were coming into the Iraqi heartland. But I did not have a very high opinion of the Iraqi army. My biggest worry was, one, Rumsfeld in the Pentagon, and two, General Tommy Franks as the on-ground commander. the CENTCOM commander. And he wasn't as arrogant as Rumsfeld, but he certainly was at least as dumb. I looked at it as a potential disaster. I knew that we were going in there without the troops to secure, among other things, the 350 arms and ammo dumps that Saddam Hussein had scattered all around the country. Mm-hmm. And a year later, we still had not secured those dumps. And the people who were blowing us up were driving in dump trucks and loading it up with 155 millimeter artillery shells and landmines and all of the stuff to make the IEDs that were causing 65% of American casualties in that operation. We didn't take enough people. And once again, stupidity of Rumsfeld. General Rick Shinseki, the chief of staff of the Army, had to go up on the Hill and testify in front of the Senate. And they asked him, well, you know, you ran the operation in Bosnia. How many American troops do we need for this operation? And Shinseki didn't want to answer because he knew it was going to bring grief on him. But he was forced to answer, and he said, you know, it's going to take 500,000 American troops to take and secure what you have taken. And the next day, Paul Wolfowitz stood up and said, that's absurd. We all know it's absurd, and Shinseki doesn't know what he's talking about. And we're going to do this with 200,000 troops, and we'll all be fine. And they're going to welcome us with, garlands of roses and parades, and we'll be liberators. Well, what could possibly go wrong with that? Only everything.
Yeah.
And it all did.
Well, when you say it all went wrong, the invasion itself, though, went fairly well, all things considered, no?
Yeah. They managed to get up to Baghdad and
I mean, they were there within 48 hours, right?
They were there fairly quickly, and then when they got there was no one to secure what they had taken. They were looting the ministries. They were stealing everything that wasn't tied down. They were, a lot of people being killed
Who's
for
the
one
they?
reason.
When you say they were looting, they were stealing, who's the they there?
The citizens of Baghdad.
Okay, you mean the Iraqi citizens, right?
The Iraqis, absolutely. The mobs could strip a ministry building of everything of value in 2 hours' time, and did. And there was no one there to say, stop. You can't do this. We're going to need this building and these files, and we're going to need that electrical plant. We're going to need all of this stuff. And back home, not even back home, in Baghdad, you've got the Tsar of Iraq sent in by the Pentagon, who discharged everyone in the Iraqi army. Sent them all home with AK-47s under their arms, with no pay, and somehow, what could go wrong with that? It had been planned going in that they would go through the ranks of Iraqi army officers and pick out the best ones and keep them on duty. This guy wiped out anybody in government who had been a member of the Ba'athist Party, and that was everybody in government. So nobody was left to run the train on time or not on time. They couldn't run it at all. And none of this had to happen. My old boss, General Colin Powell at the State Department, called in all of the Iraqi speakers and offered them to DOD, which refused to take them. He called in all of the experts on how you occupy and govern a captured land and put together a book of how you do it. And Rumsfeld, wouldn't have it, wouldn't read it, wouldn't let anybody in the Pentagon read it. So too many missed opportunities.
I know this is a difficult question to ask because some of it is based off of, how much access to information you have. And I know you probably have a ton, but I'm curious, as we sit here still with the Iraq war, I guess technically in the rearview mirror, as official operations have ceased, as of 2011 there. But,
yeah, right.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's why I say I air quoted officially, but, you get the point. History will say the war ended in 2011, even though that's not true. Beyond that, again, we talk about perspective and how the Gulf War was viewed as such a raging success. And part of that is because everybody was unequivocally on the same page about going in. Everybody was unequivocally on the same page about the mission, and it stayed the same way all the way through. And we also had a clear, defined, resolute ending to the Gulf War. We knew what the end was.
And we left.
Right, and we left. And so because we're still doing this Iraq thing, how much of the perspective of it is politically biased? How much of it? Because again, the majority of everybody in Washington was for the invasion at the time based off of the information we had. So I don't hold people, the elected officials who said yay to that at the time, I believe did the best with the information that they had. Can we have a debate about whether the information was accurate or not? I think there is one there, but I guess
there's a big one there.
Yeah, there is.
The Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld sold that invasion to the American people based on lies about nuclear development and bioweapons labs that rolled around the countryside. And for a year, American military intelligence teams combed that country looking for evidence that any of that was true and could find none of it, when they might better have spent their time finding and securing all of those arms dumps.
Well, that's what I would argue, is just simply saying that my argument would be, if somebody was on the ground there, that those weapon caches were, if you want to air quote, weapons of mass destruction. Again, they weren't nuclear, but they were enough to cause mass destruction. I mean, we found hundreds of them.
They were causing thousands of American casualties. I had them show me what they call an IED, and it passes by if you're reading the New York Times. But when you stand there and look at what makes up one of those things, and you see that first they lay 6 155 millimeter artillery shells in a row in a trench.
Yeah, it's enough to make you crap your pants.
And then they lay 100 pounds of C4 on top of that. And then they lay 3 5-gallon cans of gasoline
right
on top of that. And then they cover it up and wait for a tank or a
Humvee
Bradley
or a truck
to come along. And they're going to blow that thing to shit and everybody in it.
100%. Again, as you said, You walk up on one of those things, and the first thing that happens is your butthole clenches because you check your drawers because it scares the hell out of you. I mean,
you bet.
You
bet.
You know the amount of damage that thing can do.
You know, I've talked to doctors, specialists about traumatic brain injury that comes, even if you survive that thing, the blast puts a force on your brain that rattles it inside the skull.
It's enough to make it mush.
It screw you up completely. And every time one of those things went off, somebody suffered traumatic brain injury above and beyond those who lost legs and arms and were blown into smithereens. They're just.
Joe, does it ever amaze you, or does anything ever shock you about combat? Like we just talk about these IEDs that we see. I mean, you saw, booby trap mines and crazy things in Vietnam. Again, you go through everything that you covered. You're exasperated when I hear you talk about these IEDs and the effect of them. But are you ever surprised at the depth, and I guess for lack of a better term, at the depth of the evil that combat brings?
I can't admit to being very surprised about anything I see anymore. I think I've seen it all. But when I think that, then somebody comes along with something so goddamn evil and awful that I have to stop and put my jaw back closed.
I mean, technology is a great thing, right? But it also has a bad side because it allows the amplification of combat to take it to a whole different level. I think that's also a big part of it. Who's got the biggest toys and who can make the biggest explosions, and the constant little arms race on different countries of the world to figure that whole thing out plays a part in it.
And then you have the one constant in a war where there are hundreds of thousands of people there. You're going to have an outfit, a unit, go wrong, where they have sat there being booby-trapped, and they're angry, and they're angry at ordinary people around them who have nothing to do with what's gone wrong for them. I'm thinking about the Marine outfit on a hill that I visited and had lunch with and left, not knowing that they were the unit that massacred Iraqi villagers, raped women, and then killed them. And
was that in 2006?
That was in 2006. That's exactly right. Haditha Dam in that area.
It's mind blowing. Like, how we're capable of that, and to a certain extent, I'm never justify it, but it's one of those things when you see enough of your teammates killed, right, and you see the horror that's done to them. It becomes an eye for an eye mentality, and that's not correct. That's not the standard we hold ourselves to.
It's not according to our rules of warfare
by any stretch of the imagination.
And if you can defend that, you can defend Lieutenant Calley and Captain Medina at My Lai. Mm-hmm. And there's no defending that. Absolutely none.
No, and this
is not our way of war. And yet every war brings it on to some degree or another.
Well, with that, let's pivot a little bit and talk about the latest book, They Were Soldiers. Again, I mentioned it several times. We Were Soldiers, the story of Ia Drang in Vietnam. And so They Were Soldiers takes a different look at sort of your experience. Can you tell us more about the book?
Long overdue look at the Vietnam cohort of young Americans who, many of whom were drafted and sent to fight a very bad war far from home. And if they survived, they came home to no welcome, no honor, no parade, to a country that was sorely divided over that war and whether we should have fought it at all. And the population seemingly was unable to differentiate between a war that they hated and the warriors who were their sons and were sent under our flag to fight that war. And then the war was orphaned, if you will, and those who fought it were treated like losers, baby killers. People spat at them at the airport. Demonstrators waved signs. And they came home and went to ground. But it's, what we have done here is we did profiles and interviews with 48 Vietnam veterans, all branches, all ranks, a few civilians, a couple of Army nurses, and we focus less on the war they fought and more on the lives they have lived and the good they have done for their communities and our country since that war. And we're 55 years from the beginning of American involvement in Vietnam in 1965. And the Vietnam cohort is thinning rapidly. 3 million went and served in the Indochina theater, and I think there's less than 1 million left alive today. They're going out of the game, and we have to at least say a fond, honorable farewell to them. It's time we said to them, welcome home.
Mm-hmm.
I have spent the last 7 years working for the Vietnam War 50th anniversary commemoration, traveling this country doing video interviews with Vietnam veterans. I've got over 800 of 2-hour interviews in the can, and unedited copies go to the Library of Congress Oral History Archives. These are good people. America needs to understand that. The attitude in this country has changed with these recent wars. At least the attitude toward the troops coming home from those wars. We've all seen it in the airports. People applauding them. People giving up their seat in first class for them. And this is good. This is right. And it's done, I think, more out of guilt over how they didn't do any of that for the Vietnam veterans coming home.
Yeah, it's a question I ask a lot of Vietnam veterans as, I've interviewed them over the years and doing this podcast about how they feel about, the way veterans are treated now and men and women coming home from war now as the way they were. And they never have any angst towards people who serve now getting the warm welcome. I just think it's, they certainly still feel bitter about the way they were treated because they didn't deserve it. They obviously, a lot of them weren't, were drafted and didn't ask for this. It was just something that they had to do, and
did
right, and by miracles they survived, and they came home. To people.
They may not be bitter, but I'm bitter on their behalf.
Sure. Well, again, you saw it up close, so you have a better perspective for it.
Well, yeah, I did, and there's so many good stories in this new book. They Were Soldiers: The Sacrifices and Contributions of Our Vietnam Veterans. There's a chapter on Senator Max Cleland. There's a chapter on Diane Carlson Evans, the Army nurse who was the spark plug that got the Women's Vietnam Memorial built. There's General Colin Powell. There's General Barry McCaffrey. There's Fred Smith, the Marine captain who came home and founded a little company called FedEx. There's Judge Eileen Moore, who was also an Army nurse, who came home, went to college, got her law degree, became a judge, and started seeing Vietnam veterans in her court up on one charge or another. And she said, we have got to do something about that. And she set up the first veterans courts in California, which were the first in the country, where a Vietnam veteran charged with a crime goes before the judge, pleads guilty, and his sentence is suspended while he goes through a 3-part counseling and education and re-education. We're talking about homeless veterans, people who were deep into alcohol and drugs, and one by one, they're coming out of that clean. They're having their sentences set aside, and they become productive members of society again. And Eileen Moore just knew this was the right thing to do, and she has done it now for 20 years. There are just so many remarkable stories like that. I am proud of that book and those veterans and all of the veterans.
Well, Joe, once again, it's been an amazing pleasure talking to you. Your perspective and knowledge and years of experience in all of this just continue to astound me. I could talk to you for hours upon hours upon hours with thousands of questions just in general and about specific things. But again, the newest book, They Were Soldiers, definitely pick it up. Obviously, We Were Soldiers, the book and the movie, but I can't thank you enough again for your time. Nothing but continued health and success for you going forward. And as always, you're always welcome here on the Hazard Ground. Anytime you have something to say, our audience loves to hear it, and we certainly appreciate you joining us.
Thank you a lot, Mark.
Joe Galloway, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Good luck to you, and keep them rolling.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.